Welcome to the 2021 Sprunt Lecture Series. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. To do this, grab your smartphone and follow the instructions here on the screen. Either scan the QR code with your camera app or go to slido.com and enter the number you see on the screen. Enter your location and it will be shown here. We'll wait a moment for you to do this. When using your phone, after scanning the code, be sure to tap the pop-up on your screen to open Slido in your browser. Again, use your smartphone or go to any browser on whether it be your computer or on your phone, and scan the QR code or go to slido.com and enter the number. And we'll wait a few minutes for us to see you on the map, on the word cloud map, that is. I see Richmond, Virginia, a lot in Richmond, Virginia. Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlottesville, Virginia, Glen Allen, Virginia, Gainesville, Florida, Asheville, North Carolina, Fort Worth, Texas, Ohio, Greensville, South Carolina, Chicago, Illinois, Atlanta, Georgia, Rochester, Minnesota, Louisville, Kentucky, Dunbar, West Virginia, and Danbury, Wisconsin, Waxhaw, North Carolina. And I always shout out Raleigh, North Carolina, because that's where your announcer is from. Concord, North Carolina, Greensburg, Kentucky. All right. It's great to have you all here. Thank you very much. Our lecture is hosted by Union Presbyterian Seminary, now offering the new Master of Arts in Public Theology degree program. Are you called to be a Christian leader in the public square? Know someone considering theological education? Contact our admissions directors at admissions@upsem.edu. Our greeting, invocation, and introduction of our lecture will be given by Dr. Brian Blunt, President and Professor of New Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary. We are happy to welcome our 2021 lecturer, Dr. Ted Smith, Professor of Preaching and Ethics at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Welcoming everyone to the first of the Sprunt Lectures will be the Reverend Dr. Clay McCauley, Director of Alumni Development at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Reverend Dr. McCauley, the floor is yours.
Grace to you and peace in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and welcome to the 110th series of Sprunt Lectures, again normally held here on the Richmond campus of Union Presbyterian Seminary. My name is Clay McCauley, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director for Alumni Development, now in my 6th year. I say normally because for only the second time since the lectures began in 1912, Sprunt is not being held on our campus here on Brook Road in Ginter Park. Months ago, with the ever-increasing spread and surge of COVID-19 novel coronavirus pandemic, it became clear to our seminary leadership that we could not offer the lectures on this campus or any place in our traditional gathering and setting. Yet, with some creative thinking of our communications and advancement colleagues and seminary faculty, and the gracious cooperation of our lecturer and our 2 preachers, the worship planning team determined that it would again be best for us to offer the lectures and worship in a virtual format here online. There are a host of people serving on the staff of the seminary and our planning team who have eagerly anticipated your joining us for this evening and for the next 2 days on this StreamYard webinar. We all are delighted to have you with us via this virtual format for the lectures, the presentation of our 2021 BAA Trailblazer, 2 services of worship, and our BAA annual meeting. Again tonight at the end of this lecture, and using that Slido word cloud Mike just introduced to you, you will be asked to sum up in 1 or 2 words your reaction to what you have heard in this first lecture. Again, we're Presbyterians, so I want to tell you 1 or 2 words, if you would. Given that we have over 420 people registered to join these lectures online, and virtual technology being what it is, we are bound to encounter a few glitches along the way. So we will do our best to correct these glitches as they arise. Yet we hope you'll approach this, yet again, historic presentation of these lectures and worship with a sense of divine grace and understanding as those made and who bear the image of God. I now call on our president of Union Presbyterian Seminary, Dr. Brian Blunt, who will formally extend his welcome and as the host of this lecture and later introduce our Sprunt lecturer for this year. Yet may I be the first to say to you, we are glad you are here. Thank you.
Thank you, Clay. We are indeed glad to have each of you participating with us in this virtual way this evening. Welcome to the Sprunt Lectures of 2021. This is always a wonderful occasion for us. I remember my very first time coming to the Sprunt Lectures and the ability to mingle with so many alums from all across the country and indeed around the world pre-pandemic. And I look forward to that day post-pandemic when we will be able to gather in such a way again. But until then, we have a treat for you these next couple of days. I'm looking forward to the lectures, and I know you will find them a blessing and an enrichment for you academically as well as spiritually and faithfully. As we begin, let us do so with a word of prayer. Let us bow our heads. Holy One, we ask that you would be with us this day. Open our hearts and our minds. Help us to hear. Be with Dr. Smith as he lectures to us. Help him to share with us in ways that challenge us and nurture us and prepare us for tasks that are before us, both in the classroom and in the church, and also in the world. May these lectures be a place where we find illumination and we find encouragement and we find a sense of a creative spark that helps us as we encounter the days to come in front of us. Guide us this evening, particularly as we listen to this first lecture. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Ted Smith and I started Princeton Theological Seminary together in 1992. He got out in 3 years. It took me 15. I was just leaving a PhD program at Emory University's Graduate Division of Religion. He was just leaving a Rhodes Scholarship funded Oxford University MA program in the Joint Schools of Philosophy and Theology, where he earned first-class honors, having already graduated from Duke University before that, summa cum laude. We collided on the campus of Princeton that fall. Initially, apparently, I was unimpressed. While I don't remember this at all, and I don't have grading records that go back to those early teaching years to corroborate the claim, Dr. Smith told the story when we had gathered with some luminaries in the academic and ecclesiastical and foundation worlds for an initial conversation around his Theological Education Between the Times initiative, that I gave him a less than stellar evaluation and grade on his first paper for me. Of course, being the gifted intellectual that he is, he rebounded and produced stellar work that ranked at the top of the class by the time the course came to completion. Now, I like to think that with my rigorous demand for excellence, that I spark something in him, something that allows me to take substantial credit for everything he has accomplished since then. That initial expectation for excellence, I have no doubt, spurred along his wonderful elite appetite to plumb deep academic and scholarly and faith depths in his teaching and writing. Well, seriously, I do remember with great affection and admiration Dr. Smith's stellar gifts and stellar accomplishments while a student at Princeton Seminary. I am not surprised in the least that he has, throughout his career since graduating from PTS, gone on to achieve such wondrous academic and ecclesiastical accomplishments. Dr. Smith is professor of preaching and ethics at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. Following his studies at Duke, Oxford, and Princeton Seminary, he concluded his academic studies with a PhD with distinction at Emory University in the area of ethics and society with a Bandy Fellowship in preaching. He has taught at Candler, Emory University, and at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, where he was an assistant professor of ethics and society and director of the program in theology and practice. After 7 years at Vanderbilt, he returned to Emory, teaching, as in this case, the area of preaching and ethics. He is also a faculty member in the Graduate Division of Religion and a faculty fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory Law School. He is also a senior fellow in religion and its publics, the University of Virginia. Prior to his enrollment in Emory's PhD program, Dr. Smith also served as pastor of Presbyterian churches in Dundee and Weston, New York. His awards are many. A member of Phi Beta Kappa at Duke, he was also awarded the most outstanding graduate award in the Department of Religion, the Joel L. Fleischman Prize in Public Policy, and of course, the Rhodes Scholarship. While at Oxford, he was awarded the College Book Prize. He received numerous preaching and expository prizes while at Princeton Seminary, including a presidential fellowship. At Emory, he was awarded both the Bandy Fellowship in Preaching, as I said, and the Woodruff Fellowship. He is the author of The New Measures, A Theological History of Democratic Practice, Cambridge University Press, and We're John Brown, Divine Violence and the Limits of Ethics, Stanford University Press. He works at the intersections of practical and political theology. His first book, The New Measures, tells a history of preaching that gives rise to eschatological visions of modern democracy. His second book, We're John Brown, works through memories of the raid on Harper's Ferry to show the limits of social ethics for thinking about systemic racism and violence. He has edited collections of essays on sexuality and ordination, contemporary issues in preaching, and economic inequality. He serves as the director of Theological Education Between the Times, a project that gathers diverse groups of people to think together about the meanings and purposes of theological education in a time of great change. As director of this project, he has edited several volumes in a series for Erdmans that will eventually include 12 books. Already published are such excellent texts as Chloe T. Sun's Attempt Great Things for God, Theological Education in Diaspora, Daniel Aylshire's Beyond Profession, The Next Future of Theological Education, and Willie James Jennings, After Whiteness and Education and Belonging. And Ted, we are going to be as a faculty talking with Willie and about that book in the fall semester. He has also co-edited Spring and Capital in an Age of Inequality with Robert P. Jones, Questions Preachers Ask, Essays in Honor of Thomas G. Long with Scott Black Johnston and Leonora Tubbs Tisdale, and has edited Frequently Asked Questions About Sexuality, Bible, and the Church, Plain Talk About Tough Issues. He has also drafted a host of journal articles, chapters and edited volumes, articles for general readership, and dictionary, lectionary, and other short essays. He lectures and preaches widely around the country and the world. I could not be more pleased to welcome to Union Presbyterian Seminary one of my gifted former students who has gone on to teach in a place we both hold dear. His topic, No Longer Shall They Teach One Another, The End of Theological Education, is intriguing and provocative in the best of ways. Tonight he speaks to us on the subtopic, Consolidation. Please join me in giving him the warmest of welcomes to our seminary community. in this virtual way. Dr. Smith, the virtual lectern is yours.
Thank you, President Blunt. I had prepared to say that I was honored by the introduction and the invitation, but I'm even more honored than I knew I would be. I have the highest respect for you, and your words mean a lot. Thank you. I'm honored too because just of the distinguished quality of these lectures and of this historic seminary. I mean, Union's alumni form a distinguished list, and for me, that list is personal. I think especially of my Candler colleague, Jennifer Ayers, and my co-conspirator in all matters political and theological, David True, both alums of this school. And I think of my pastor, the Reverend Amantha Barbie, who leads Oakhurst Presbyterian Church in Decatur, Georgia. And I'm mindful of past Sprunt lecturers, including my teachers, Tom Long, Carol Newsom, Brooks Holyfield, people I admire very much. They and a long list of others hallow these lectures. And so I'm honored and frankly a little incredulous to be asked to share in this distinguished line. And President Blunt, I'm honored by the invitation because of my respect for you. It was 30 years ago. How can that be that we both started at Princeton Seminary? And while you might not have kept exact records, I have kept those records. And I can say with some confidence that Dr. Blunt gave me the worst grade I received on any assignment K through PhD. I mean that not with hyperbole, but very literally. The worst grade on any assignment, any single assignment, K through PhD. So my advice from that experience is don't make an argument about a word, what a word means in the Gospels based on an English language concordance. Never do that. Never. I've never done it since. But, you know, as searing as that experience was, it's not what I remember most about that class. That was a life-changing class. It was one of my first glimpses of what it could look like to hold together serious scholarship and authentic faith and a passion for justice. Up to that point, I had known people who excelled in one or the other of these areas, but I'd never seen them all come together, and I wasn't even sure they could. But Dr. Blunt, reading Matthew with you, I saw scholarship, faith, and justice all come together in the text and in your life and in my hopes for my own life. So I'm grateful for that witness and so grateful all the more for this invitation. Thank you. I want to offer further thanks to some other partners, and to do that, I'm going to share my screen. As Dr. Blunt mentioned, I've been active in working with a band of conspirators in this Theological Education Between the Times project. And there's really no way to talk about what I want to talk about tonight without acknowledging those friends, because the conversations with them have done so much to shape what I have to say to you. Especially these 12 senior fellows who are part of the project. Dr. Blunt already mentioned them. The books are coming out. After Whiteness was the first, but they're rolling out steadily. It's been a great privilege to be part of these conversations. And the conversations have now really moved to another level because of the partnership and leadership of my colleague, Lucille Crana, here at Candler. So we're excited about where things are going, and we hope these lectures can be part of that, and that you'll join us as we continue that conversation. You can join us here. You can find out more about theological education between the times through that website, tebt.candler.emory.edu. I want to speak with you about the end of theological education. Now, I mean end in at least two senses. First, I want to name the way in which some mode of theological education is ending. It's coming to a close. Now, the most dramatic marker of this end is the number of schools that have ended one mode of their existence for another. Now, they might not have closed, but they've changed in fundamental ways. And that list, you all know the list, or at least big chunks of it. It begins close to home with the change in the life of the Presbyterian School of Christian Education, the change in Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond. It extends to venerable schools like Bangor, Seabury Western, Episcopal Divinity School, Andover Newton, the first graduate school of any kind in the United States. Now, most of these schools continue in some way or another, but all of them have left behind models of theological education that they inhabited for more than a century. And they really only begin the list. The list of schools making deep changes runs to Lexington and Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School, to Claremont, to United in the Twin Cities, to St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas City, all of which have sold all or part of their campuses. The other union, the one in New York, has monetized its property in new ways. Fuller, one of the largest seminaries in the country, contemplated selling its Pasadena campus. Luther, a denominational flagship seminary, did sell part of its campus. And after some spectacular growth, the Divinity School at Liberty University, right down the road from y'all, recently made massive cuts in its faculty. Even Princeton Theological Seminary, with the largest endowment in all of theological education, is selling a chunk of its campus as part of a strategic plan. So I want to stress again that most of these schools haven't ended, but they continue in vibrant mission. But something is ending. Now, there are exceptions. There are places where nothing seems to be changing, nothing seems to be ending. But even when the name on the building remains the same, the changes in the work of an institution can run so deep, and the changes in the cultural context in which the institution makes sense can run so broad, that it's fair to say that something is ending. So too, there are all kinds of signs of new beginnings. There are new schools, there's new kinds of schools, new efforts beyond schools. Theological education is not coming to an end. Theological education will continue, not because we get it right, but because God longs to be known. But when this many institutions are closing, and when many, many more are facing existential struggles, it's not just a changing of the guard with new personnel in the same regime. Something is ending. And I want to think with you about the end of theological education in that sense. And second, I want to think with you about the end of theological education in the sense of the end point, the destination, the purpose, the telos. What's the end of all this? What's all this for? Acknowledging the first kind of end makes the second kind of end especially important. For when a form of life is coming to an end, we've got to take up the work of figuring out what to keep, what to set aside, what to transform, what to invent anew. And to do that work, we can't just be focused on means. We need to be focused on ends, on what all this is for in the highest and fullest sense. That is, we can't be consumed by the means of fundraising and enrollment management and grading papers, as important as these things are, not even by the longer term means of curriculum reform and building and rebuilding a faculty so that it is deeply diverse and richly excellent in all the ways a faculty needs to be excellent today. No, when a whole form of life is coming to an end, and remember, a way of life can end even when an institution retains its name and its buildings. When a form of life is coming to an end, we can't be thinking about the means for sustaining that way of life, or we can't think only about that. We need to be thinking about what that life is for, about the telos, about the end in this second sense, so that we can receive this new life to which we are called. I want to take up this work with you over these 4 lectures. This evening, I'm going to try to tell a truthful story about how the present prevailing mode of theological education emerged. I'm going to describe a process of consolidation in which the model becomes more and more established. That's lecture 1. Then tomorrow morning, I'll describe the ways this model has been dispossessed. I choose the word carefully. I'm not trying to describe disappearance. The prevailing model is still very visible. But I mean to describe a dispossession in which something has been lost, in which the possession of a quality of establishment has been taken away. The model loses its possession of status, among other things. And more tendentiously, and perhaps more hopefully in the end, I want to describe the ways this deep alliance with status has possessed us, and how the loss of it can be a kind of exorcism, a dispossession. That's lecture 2. The story of consolidation and dispossession leaves us asking what to do next. And that's the turn I want to make tomorrow evening in the 3rd lecture. I'll begin with an extended meditation on Jeremiah 31, the hope of exiles. No longer shall they teach one another, the prophet says, for they shall all know me, from the least to the greatest. I want to think with you about the kind of hope this vision makes possible. It begins with letting go, with renunciations of our efforts to sustain our teaching and learning by our own power. That's lecture 3. And once our hands are no longer clinging to what we have made with them, we can open them to take hold of contours that the grace of God illumines in the present. I borrow from the phenomenological tradition to call these affordances. I mean to use a term that's more ambivalent than opportunity, because these contours are as much obstacles as opportunities. They're not simply good and full of good potential. Sometimes they can only be part of God's redeeming work by paradox. So I don't mean to promise progress towards a brave new world from seeds that are already there. I mean to describe something better. Life in a real world that is created, redeemed, judged, and sustained by a God who promises not to leave us bereft. Theological education will continue because God longs to be known. So the first topic I want to take up with you tonight is consolidation. I see this lecture as a genetic history of a dominant form. As a genetic history, what I'm trying to do is to tell where the present came from. And I'm trying to do it in a way that makes clear how it operates and what ends it's designed to seek. That's what I mean by a genetic history. And it's a genetic history that's not comprehensive. It's not a history of all of theological education in North America. Glenn Miller's written the closest thing to that we have, and it's really good. I'm not offering that comprehensive history, but a genetic history of a dominant form, a statement that dominance is a statement more about power than about numbers. Because numerically, the majority of preachers in American history, and likely even the majority of preachers right now, did not get the kind of post-baccalaureate degree that Union offers, that Candler offers, not the kind of theological education that I'm going to be talking about. But those who did get this kind of education have had majoritarian power. And so it's been a dominant form. That's the work of tonight's lecture. I want to describe a process of consolidation that is a genetic history of a dominant form. I want to start with a quick sketch of what came before that dominant form. You could describe it in many ways, but I want to pick up on one vernacular phrase from early New England, and that is the standing order. Talk of the standing order was used to describe the aspiration to a seamless garment of religion, economy, society, and family in Connecticut. And I use that term not because I'm making the New Haven mistake, the New Haven fallacy, where all the world is Connecticut. I'm not saying that, but just to gain some specificity, even as I'm trying to describe a broader phenomena. And because some of the earliest theological schools in North America were in New England. So it goes without saying, but it must be said and said again. that this ideology of the standing order, it runs from European settlement through the early national period, from early 17th century to early 19th century. This is the early ideology of settler colonialism. It's the ideology that fit with the sacred errand into the wilderness that legitimated both genocide and slavery. We can't tell this story without naming that. It's also worth remembering that those evils lasted long beyond this early dispensation. And so it tied themselves to them. They bound themselves to it. But the two are not identical. Let's dig into the standing order. Then, European settlers had dreams that were shaped by the established churches in Europe. And while none of them could impose that dream nationally, different traditions aspired to a kind of establishment in different regions. So the Anglicans along the James River didn't really have full establishment like you had with the Church of England, but some of the laws made it sound as if they did or should, and they aspired to it. So too the Dutch Reformed up the Hudson Valley, Puritans on the Connecticut and the Charles Rivers. And the Presbyterians, the Quakers, and the Baptists, and some other sects, some other movements, never quite had the dominance in a region where they could aspire to be that establishment. But they offered a tacit endorsement of establishment by accepting the role of a dissenting church in the English system. So if, for instance, Presbyterians move into the same space of a dissenting church that they have in England under the Church of England, they're not saying that we are the established church, but they're still having an imagination, a social imaginary that is shaped by that old model of European establishment. Now, the standing order was the name given to this aspirational establishment. It has to be named as aspirational because even in Connecticut, even in Massachusetts, it was never fully actualized. But as an aspiration, it was there and it was powerful. And the key features included this really tight network of ecclesial, political, and economic powers. The church, the Congregational Church, was established by law, and it was supported by taxes. The law reflected the values of the church, like the Sabbath was mandatory, and the church oversaw the public schools. So for you social theorists who are keeping score at home, it's something like what Charles Taylor has called Paleo-Durkheimian. That Paleo-Durkheimian, like the original, the core old Durkheim vision, a direct form of the unified social order described by Emil Durkheim, in which a single sacred canopy holds together church, state, and every dimension of life. Crucially, in this Paleo-Durkheimian dispensation, there's not in this Paleo-Durkheimian imaginary, there's not a pluralism of religious traditions, and there's not a differentiation of spheres that comes with full-on modernity. Religion doesn't exist in a separate sphere. So this is what I'm trying to describe. This is not the order we have now. This is what came before that order. It was, we'll call it Paleo-Durkheimian. The core institutions of this standing order, there were many, but I want to focus on three. One of them is the village church. The village church was not really a parish because it depended on people choosing to join it or not. And whether or not to join a church in New England, whether or not one was qualified to join a church in New England, wanted to assume all the burdens of joining a church in New England. This was a big and difficult decision for folks. So there's a voluntary quality that there wasn't in a European parish, but the Connecticut village church was still shaped by the imaginary of a parish. In the minds of the founders, there's only one of these churches, only one church in town, and it's in the center of town, and its buildings serve civic as well as religious functions. And then all those within its bounds are part of it. If they're not like part of it as a member, then they're in this kind of penumbra around it. And if they're not even in that, then it's not that they're part of another tradition, it's that they are beyond the pale. Brooks Holyfield called this model of American congregation a comprehensive congregation. So we've got the village church, which is different than what the kind of congregations that we have now. Another core institution was ministry. And ministry in the standing order can best be described as an office. It was an office, not unlike the office of governor or squire. It was related directly to the state. It performed civic and religious duties, and was funded, the salaries paid by taxes. There's blurry lines between these civic and religious duties. Are you working in the religious sphere or the civic sphere when you pray over the artillery? And then ministers, the further way this is an office is that ministers were appointed, were ordained, were elected to a particular place. Ordination it was not always, at least, a mobile credential, as it will become with professionalization. It's an office, and it's bound to a place. So we've got the village church as parish, ministry as an office, and then theological education that is part of a classical education that doesn't really differentiate itself from general education. Early colleges were founded to educate people primarily for service to church and the state. And these two purposes were only minimally differentiated, not just in the kind of way that the institution spoke about itself, but the people took the same classes. It was the same course of study in a pretty small institution, the same formational apparatus and the same degree. Ministers might have just had a little topping up as apprentices to someone after they finished, but the core education in a school was just like the one that a governor would receive or a lawyer of some kind. So as a result, the boundaries between political office, ecclesial leadership, and academic work are all, for professors, they're all super fluid. These individuals went to school together. They were part of a kind of caste, and people moved easily between these roles. So the village church as parish, ministry as an office, and theological education as part of classical education. You can see this dynamic in some of the early charters of Yale College. The 1701 charter says that the school is founded so that people may be fitted for public employment in both church and state. That's still there in 1745, state as well as the church. You'll see really similar language in Harvard, founded 1636, and also in William and Mary, founded 1693. All of them share that social imaginary where church, state, and other spheres of society are one. And so the educational order parallels that unity. Everybody's educated together. With time, though, the standing order comes unraveled. This happens in different times, in different regions. It happens across the 18th century, and it's acute after the Revolution. There's all kinds of reasons for this. It'd be a lecture in itself, but individualist strains were always present. Even in 1619, even in early New England, you've got Anne Hutchison and Roger Williams. It was also the case that the frontier was just too big to supervise. You have pastors and Episcopal priests in Virginia complaining about how are they supposed to exercise anything like discipline way upriver or towards the frontier. So you couldn't kind of have the standing order throughout these regions. It was just too hard. It was also the case that many of the colonies had strong commercial interests at their heart, and they weren't terribly interested in holding together church, state, all of that in a single, they just wanted to sell to whoever would buy at the highest price. So the commercial interests drove pluralization. Migration enhanced that pluralization. And then the revivals that broke out through the late 18th and early 19th century are really interesting because they increase participation in religion even as they dissolve the dominant order. They dissolve establishment, because what they do is they produce more movements, and they also generate an ethos in which people no longer respond to pastors who exercise their role as an office. And then different establishments in different regions made any federal establishment impossible. So after the revolution, after the nation comes together, you can't, even if you could have achieved it in Massachusetts and in Virginia, you can't achieve it by putting them together because you've got different traditions. So there's just not going to be that standing order at a national scale. To people who were really, really committed to the standing order, when it started to unravel, it felt like the end of the world. And in a way, it was. Lyman Beecher, who was a Presbyterian and Congregationalist, who was one of the anointed heirs of the standing order in Connecticut, when he was preaching there in Connecticut in 1814, he pulled out all the stops. So he's seeing the standing order unravel. And he says, there are grievous desolations in this state. Societies might be named where the church is extinct and the house of God is in ruins. And then he goes on, that last paragraph on this slide. The bondage of corruption commencing here will extend through eternity. The career of iniquity here begun will hold on to its unobstructed course and never end. But a funny thing happened on the way to the end of the world. A new social order emerged. And this is one of the main things that I want you to take from these lectures, is that with that transition from a standing order, from an established church, from a Paleo-Durkheimian order to what came next, what I'll call an age of association, when that transition happened, the people who were deeply invested in the old order thought that the world was coming to an end. They thought the church was coming to an end. They thought the whole thing was over, but it wasn't. A new social order emerged. That social order carried with it many of the same problems and injustices. It wasn't a brave new world, but a new kind of order emerged. I think we're standing in an analogous time now. That order that emerged after the revolution is breaking up, has been breaking up for the last 50 years. And it can feel like the end of the world. But we've been here before. We've been here before. I use here language of age, an age of association that stretched, I want to say, from the revivals and revolution to the long, are they over yet? 60s. And I hesitate to use language of ages because times are always complex. They're always contested. And ages never adequately captures that. But I hope you'll let it be a kind of fallible shorthand that is useful to the extent that it illumines both what fits and what doesn't. But because there were some really deep shifts in the structure of society in the early 19th century. When this social order emerged, many people shared Lyman Beecher's view that with disestablishment, religion, indeed all of social life, was just going to wither away and disappear. So when the French aristocrat, diplomat, dilettante, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he visited America in the 1831, he was surprised and fascinated to see something else. It wasn't all falling apart. What he saw instead was this: as soon as some inhabitants of the United States have conceived of a sentiment or an idea that they want to bring about in the world, they seek each other out. And when they've found each other, they unite. From that moment, they are no longer isolated men, but a power that is seen from afar and whose actions serve as an example. A power that speaks and to which you listen. He called this a spirit of association. And Tocqueville was kind of blown away by all the different kinds of association that he found in North America. He says, look at all these crazy things they do. What they establish seminaries, build inns, erect churches, distribute books and missionaries all over the world. And he makes this observation, which I think is very insightful. Wherever at the head of a new undertaking, you see in France, the government, it's transferred to the state. In England, a great lord. In the United States, you see an association. So this network of voluntary societies radiated throughout the continent. The associations are new institutional forms. They're not invented from scratch, but they were new institutional forms and they fit the time. People responded. One measure of this is that in 1776, about 17% of the non-enslaved population, the people who had a choice about whether they wanted to go to church, about 17% of the population were affiliated with a church. That's a shockingly low number. It's a number that undoes any easy narrative about the founding of a Christian America and a long decline. But that number of 17% doubles by 1850. And then after a little pause and a dip during the Civil War, it continues to the extraordinary levels of religious participation that marked American life all through the 20th century. So if you want to understand the difference between the US and Europe on secularization, here's my nickel theory. It's right here. US religious institutions made a transition from the standing order, the ancien regime, to a new kind of institution that fit with the social forms, values, and ways of living of an emerging modernity. It's not about science and religion. No. It's about institutional forms. The European churches clung to establishment and so to older institutional forms. They never made the transition, and so they withered. But the US churches made this transition to an age of association, and because they fit the times, they thrived. Beecher saw this, so by 1827, just 13 years after he had declared the end of Christianity in North America, he preached a sermon on Revelation 21. He that sitteth upon the throne saith, Behold, I make all things new. And he concludes the sermon at the very time, or he says in the sermon, when the civil law had become impotent for the support of religion and the prevention of immoralities, God began to pour out his Spirit upon the churches and the voluntary associations. And then he goes on to say, I thought the damage was irreparable, but it's the best thing that ever happened to the state of Connecticut. Disestablishment cut the churches loose from dependence on state support. It threw them wholly on their own resources and on God. So we're talking about a transition to, again, pick up Charles Taylor's language, which you can use if it's helpful, and you can set aside if it's not. But there's a transition from a Paleo-Durkheimian form of the standing order to what Taylor calls a Neo-Durkheimian form for the age of association. I want to break that down, these institutional transitions. One of them is in the churches, from dreams of being an established church, like the Church of England or like the Catholic Church in France, to being denominations that understood themselves as one religion among a number of legitimate options. A denomination is not an established church. It's not even a dissenting church like Baptists in England. It's rather a religious body that understands itself as a peer among many other non-established but legitimate religions that are all under the canopy of a single state. That's one transition. A second transition that happens is congregations move from being village churches to being voluntary societies. And this means they have different patterns of affiliation. Membership isn't just from being in the region. There's lots of places you can choose to go. But it also means that membership is the boundaries of it are less fuzzy. You're either a member or you're of this congregation or you're not. They also add on new funding methods, not by taxes and eventually not by pew rent, which endured for a while, but by voluntary contributions. There's rhetorical shifts. This is what the New Measures book of mine is about. As these social changes happen, persuasion becomes more important. Preachers drive towards decision, as Charles Finney said. And there's a shift in church governments. It varied by tradition. It still does, of course, but there's an increasing authority for members of the congregation. So congregations are going from village churches to voluntary societies in this constellation. So too, ministry is going from being an office to being something like a profession. Never fully a profession. There's always been resistance and contestation. There's always been pluralism across traditions, but there is a shift from ministers being something like a squire or a governor and more like a lawyer or a physician. And this depends on the emergence of the category in political economy of a professional that happens especially in the latter half of the 19th century. The professional has these characteristics, neither labor nor capital in an industrializing world. Unlike capital, the professional earns a living by his or her own work. And unlike labor, though, the professional has a great degree of autonomy and is not relying on capital for the means of production. So too, the professional is delivered from ordinary market relations. The professional has this long training in a clearly defined area of knowledge. That area of knowledge, whether it's like health or whether it's law or whether it's divinity, that becomes something that is incommensurable with other goods. Because it's incommensurable, it's not subject to exchange. It doesn't become a simple commodity like steel or something else, or a harness for a horse. And because the good is unlike others, only a professional can judge another professional's work. So what that means in practice is that professionals organize into guilds like the AMA, the ABA, presbyteries, professional guilds that have the power, the AAR, the SBL, that have the power to create meaningful barriers to entry. With professions, there's also a strong moral component. There's required trust. Because professionals claim a specialized knowledge that others don't have, you've got to trust them. And that trust was supposed to be reciprocated with a professional ethos, where the client's interests are placed ahead of the professional's own. That's a different ethic than the one that was supposed to prevail in business. Caveat emptor is not supposed to apply when you go see your doctor or your lawyer or your accountant or your physician. Professions also are supposed to offer in this idealized form a career or a life course, not just a sequence of deals like with a business person or the iterative labor of farming, but a life course, a career as one grows in knowledge. The last of these transitions, the one I want to focus on the most, is theological education, moving from reading classics to professional education. It may seem obvious to us today that higher education would be the portal to professional status, but it was not at all obvious in the 19th century. One could get knowledge needed for professional practice in other ways. In England, they still have the Inns of Court for lawyers. And in America, there was a long tradition of apprenticeship for ministers, physicians, and lawyers. My point is that people could have learned what they needed. In lots of ways, higher education was not the only possibility. And that's especially true in the late 19th century. Colleges and seminaries were slow to change. Can you imagine? They were still invested in this classical ideal of education, hadn't really fully committed to the professional order. And so the enrollment was going down in colleges. There was a general lack of energy, and people were getting trained for professions in all kinds of ways. But one of the things I'll talk about in lecture 3 is the way higher education and the professional identity, they really came together in mutually legitimating forms. So the professional model for theological education, as we zoom in even more, theological education, it take on these features. It's for training clergy. It happens in accredited schools that are part of the higher education sector. Theological education is itself a species of professional education, and it promises entry into a career, and that promise justifies expense, even debt. We take all this for granted, but what I want you to remember is that it emerged in time. It could have been otherwise. Indeed, it has been otherwise. And because of that, we can say with confidence that it could be otherwise. Here's a series of dates for how this came together. Notice Union is early on in this move. 1807, Andover is really the first seminary and the first graduate school of any kind founded in North America on this new model. With it, you get a real separation of general education and theological education. It's so separate that you have different schools. Shortly on its heels, the antecedent of Union is founded. Then we kind of move through the rest of this history that I'll discuss over the course of the lectures. As the professional model comes together, people begin to think about it, begin to think about what it needs to look like. William Adams Brown, a Presbyterian minister who was professor of systematic theology at the Other Union in New York, he named this ideal in 1919. He says, more even than it has been in the past, the seminary of the future must be a training school for ministers. And here his imagination is limited. Men, he says, who have given themselves to a definite task. All that we do must be shaped to this end. No study must be admitted to the curriculum, no matter how attractive it may be, that cannot be shown to have some direct bearing on the minister's task. And conversely, no study must be omitted, however great the tax it may make on time and energy, which can be shown to be necessary for ministerial efficiency. So this is what Brown is articulating, is a rationalization, a pointing of the whole project of theological education towards preparing the minister as professional. William Rainey Harper, the Old Testament scholar who was also kind of picked by John D. Rockefeller to found the University of Chicago, he shared this, and he says, look, we've got to get rid of Hebrew. Sorry, Sam. Sorry, Bible faculty. He says, no greater farce may be found in any field of educational work than that which is involved in the teaching and study of the Hebrew language in many theological seminaries. It may be suggested that to make Hebrew an elective is to lower the standard of theological education, but those who know the facts connected with the study of Hebrew by theological students will not make this claim. Now, I don't want to enter the argument about whether or not you should need to study Hebrew to get an MDiv, but what Harper is saying is, you don't need it in order to attain this professional status. It doesn't have that kind of utility that becomes central to this model. And I think it's safe to say that that ethos has won out in a significant way, certainly when you look at ATS as a whole. So to sum up, a series of institutional transitions from this standing order, Paleo-Durkheimian, to an age of association, Neo-Durkheimian. And at the core of this is a shift of churches from dreams of establishment to denominations, for congregations moving from village churches to voluntary societies, ministry moving from office to something like a profession, and theological education moving from reading classics to professional education. So what I want you to see is the way all these things fit together. Theological schools offer professional education to people leading voluntary societies of many kinds. Seminaries are the hub of early voluntary societies. Denominational bodies found seminaries, and seminaries inculcate denominational ethos and identity, so they fit together. And with a disestablishment, the state isn't involved in setting the boundaries of the profession of ministry, as it does with law, medicine, and other fields, but you can't have a profession without barriers to entry. And so those are supplied by the denominations with their ordination standards that are nationwide, and by theological schools with graduation standards. ATS, which emerges in 1918, is crucial for this work. It enforces the ideals of professional education, and it also, what I want you to see is it marks religious movements as full-fledged denominations, as connected to the state in that pattern of mutual legitimation that I was wanting to describe. So it nurtures the denominational mindset that regards one movement as one among many legitimate movements. That's why I really believe there is no broader or more important ecumenical institution in the US or in US history than the ATS. So the dominant form of today, it's this right here. This is what it looks like. This arose as part of this whole ecology. And we can't think about theological education and how to reform it or what it needs to be next without thinking about this wider ecology. All right, in conclusion, I want to think with you about what I'll call expansion, absorption, and torsion. As Chris Coble of the Lilly Endowment said recently, what's really interesting about this constellation of institutions is not that they're decaying now, everything decays. What's interesting is how long they've lasted and how robust they've been. So I want to describe why, just a little bit, why they've been so robust and the strains, the torsions that have marked them. By 1835, our old friend Lyman Beecher was so thoroughly adapted to the age of association that he'd become a seminary president. As president of Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, a Presbyterian seminary that folded into McCormick about 100 years ago, but that's another story. But as president of Lane, Beecher was back east raising funds. And the core of his argument was that the lands drained by the Mississippi hung in the balance. We could lose them, he said, to the First Nations, or we could lose them to the Catholics. But the key, he said, to the settlement project was this new social technology. This is my language, not his, but it's what he was saying. The key to the settlement project is the social technology of the voluntary society. States couldn't do it. Government couldn't do it. We needed that explosion of voluntary societies, especially that had come out of Protestant New England. Needed schools, churches, libraries to settle the place. And crucially, Beecher said, we needed an institution that trained the leaders of all those voluntary societies. And that institution was the seminary. So the seminary, in Beecher's view, was core to this whole project of settling the West. And he wasn't wrong in that estimation. So this constellation expanded with and it enabled white Protestant settlement. And the seminary was at the center. And it then proved remarkably durable. Because of the denominational ethos, it could absorb racial caste and new immigrant communities and new religious movements and religions beyond Christianity. It could absorb racial caste. With the denominational ethos, you could make room for a segregated denomination. You could make room for an HBCU that had the same institutional form, is included under the same umbrella of meaning if assigned to a secondary role. New immigrant communities, from Swedish Lutherans to Polish Catholics to Brazilian Pentecostals, they all learned to fit themselves to the constellation of congregation and denomination through a process of what sociologists call institutional isomorphism. And new religious movements do the same. It took about 100 years, but Mormons became a denomination, though they've never joined the full constellation. But new religious movements know to take their place, they need to have voluntary society congregations. They need to become something like a denomination. And eventually, they'll even professionalize their clergy and educate them through professional education. And that's true also for religions beyond Christianity. As Stephen Warner has noted, Buddhists who come to the US, they learn to form voluntary societies. They might be called temples, but they're not like a temple in Southeast Asia. They function more like a North American congregation. Institutional isomorphism. So too, mosques become congregations. Imams gradually become professional clergy. Now, this absorption is never total, but it's powerful. And it's a big part of why this model, this constellation, has been able to endure. It's never been absolute. It's always faced challenge. But again, I think the remarkable thing is the way it has absorbed those challenges over time. And one way you can see that is in the growth of ATS. You might have initially had some strong pushback on ATS from anti-clerical traditions like the Church of Christ. But now the Church of Christ has ATS-accredited seminaries. Catholics were very ambivalent about a professional education for the priesthood. Orthodox even more so, but Catholic and Orthodox schools are now part of this professional theological constellation. Charismatic traditions had their own concerns, but the Assemblies of God and other Pentecostal seminaries have been joining since the 90s. So this power to overcome initial resistance with an expanding and durable constellation. All right, in the last 2 minutes, I want to say that that is powerful and it's been able to expand and absorb, but there are torsions that are built into it. Torsion, I mean a kind of twist that's there even in what seems like a solid surface. One twist that's built into the model is between the academic and practical. Reams of paper have been published on tensions between academic and practical ideals, and that's because of the tension is built into this model. Theological education wins a place in higher education by making itself a professional school. But the faculty are formed by not by a professional ideal, but by wissenschaftlich ideals, by their own guilds. They're pulled to them by their ongoing participation in the guilds. but then they teach people who are preparing for ministry. This isn't a failing of individuals. This tension between the academic and the practical or professional, it's baked into the structure. I could say more on this, but let me move on to say another tension is that it is both democratizing and dominating. At the heart of the professional ideal is a meritocratic vision of educated excellence that is only legitimate because it claims that it's open, at least in principle, to all people. It's not birth, but it's talent, merit, and achievement. So it seems it is democratizing, and it is genuinely committed to a democratizing ethos, the professional education is. At the same time, we know that this ideal is raced, it is classed, it is gendered. Willie James Jennings' book, After Whiteness, dissects this in the Contemporary Theological Academy. When you read that book this fall, also read Carrie Day's Notes of a Native Daughter, talking about the effects on a body of studying and teaching as a Black woman in predominantly white institutions. So there's a democratizing ethos, but there's also interior to the professional value, there is a raced ideal, a gendered ideal that is dominating. It's also the case, as I'll play out in lecture 3, that professionals end up exerting an anti-democratic social control. But for now, let's just let that stand as tension. Finally, this model is both critical and conformed. Denominations can be really critical because they're not identical to the state, and they can be richly plural. But it's exactly as denominations, even when they're critical, that they are tangled in cycles of mutual legitimation with the state. The political order is the kind of political order that can make that descent possible. So when the church takes on that denominational location, even if it speaks critically with its voice, structurally, it's so committed to that mutual cycle of legitimation that it is conformed to the powers of this age. It is both critical and conformed. So, in sum, I've tried to give a genetic history of a dominant order. I've tried to describe a constellation that emerged with the last major transition in social structures, that arose across 2 centuries and has proven to be remarkably expansive and durable and powerful, even as it has been wrenched by pervasive torsions. It has endured. And now it's coming apart. It seems like the world is coming to an end. But then we've been here before. And that's tomorrow morning's lecture. I hope to see you then.
Thank you so much, Ted. What a wonderful, powerful lecture to open us to the beginning. You know, I was trying to think as I was listening, Clay invited us to think about our word for the after part. Now, what was my word going to be? Because I need a word, right? I have to set a model as I am giving a word of thanks. Just before you ended, I had written down not a word, but a phrase, been here before. And then you ended with that. And for me, this whole thing, as you know, I do a good bit of work in the book of Revelation. Behold, I am doing a new thing. That whole sense of the new creates fear. And you've explained that expertly, that fear that we've seen in the past. We're seeing it in the present. And the question is, do we have the faithfulness to be able to move with the transition, what God may be doing, even though we can't see what God is doing or what is happening in the world around us of theological education? We're caught there. I, as a president, chief anxiety officer of an institution, I know that feeling quite well. I feel like it's my job to stop this kind of transition from taking place. But seeing it in the broader context is incredibly helpful. So thank you for expanding our horizons so that we see not just where we are, but we see where we are in relationship to where we've been. And that gives you a bit of hope, a bit of belief that there is a telos that we might not be able to see, but that perhaps God is pushing us toward. And that's At the same time, recognizing the anxiety of this moment, it helps us understand and recognize the possibility of this moment, and whether or not we can lean into that possibility becomes the question. So yes, for a theological educator, this is a wonderful lecture, and I think for everyone who's a student or who's a teacher or who is connected with these associations we call congregations, this is a meaningful word for us today. Thank you. One other thing, as I'll say, as I go around preaching and teaching in congregations, I recognize, that we're getting older as congregations. And as our congregations get older, we become a little bit more unsettled about what the future holds for the churches. This is a wonderful message for churches to see themselves, not just theological education, but our churches to see within the broader context of where we are. So thank you. Thank you for this lecture tonight. I'm looking forward to the others that will follow. So Clay, I've taken more than a word, but you can tell I've been excited about this lecture this evening. So let me pass it on to you before I keep talking.
That's fine. Very good. Thank you. No, as I was listening to this great lecture as well, I thought there's no way I can sum this up in one word. So I'm going to give 2 or 3 words. And for me, it was theological association. That's just what resounded with me as I was seeing this shift occurring. And also hope, was another word. So I'm going to invite others to, again, use that word cloud to pipe in some of the words. And it's okay if it's 2 or 3 words or more. Just what resonated with you in your reaction to this stirring lecture. We'll take a minute or two. As words are popping up, I may make an announcement or two, but let's see what words do appear. I'm going to tell you while we're waiting for some words to appear that our morning worship tomorrow at 11 o'clock will be led by the Reverend Jarrett McLaughlin and the Reverend Meg Peary McLaughlin, who serve as co-pastors of the University Presbyterian Church in Chapel Hill. Okay, so knowledge was a word that pops up. Hopeful but concerned are some words that arise. Dr. Blunt said, been here before. Crossings is another word in response to this lecture on consolidation. Been here before. Yes, exactly. And I'll pipe in mine. I think it's there. Yeah, let me just go ahead and send it there. Yeah. Theological association. Oh, convicted. All right. Or now what? Classical and contextual. I also had thought of the word classical. Change. Positive. Yes, indeed. All right. Here's some other words. Comprehensive toward, I'm sorry, I missed it. It moved. Towards future. Comprehensive towards future. Change positive. Yeah. Endurance is another word that pops up. Ready for change. Still here. Needed now, I think is what I'm seeing. Some of these words are small. Yeah. Looking to the next thing. All right. Some great words that came bubbling up in our minds as we were listening to this very stirring lecture. You see if there's any others before we transitioning is another word. Needed now. Okay. Wow. Okay, I'm going to let those continue to just pop up, and I'm going to make a couple of announcements before we conclude. We will reconvene here virtually in StreamYard at 9 o'clock in the morning for Dr. Ted Smith's second lecture in this series, No Longer Shall They Teach One Another the End of Theological Education, a lecture, as he told us, entitled Dispossession. All the lectures are being recorded and will be available to you if you click the Watch Now button on the Sprunt schedule that you were sent this morning. You'll also receive another schedule in the morning and on Wednesday morning. So it's at the top of your email box. So just look for it sometime between 8 and 9 in the morning, or the best thing to do is just really bookmark what is sent, and that way you can easily access it. Also tomorrow, a virtual alumni gathering will follow morning worship. That gathering will occur at 12:30, and it will be to honor our Black Alumni Association Trailblazer of the Year, Dr. Rochelle White. So you'll want to be sure to attend that. Still seeing some great words here. Apocalyptic. End is beginning. Gosh, these are some great words. Yeah. So, Ted, you really did stir a lot of thinking here. Thank you so very much. I'm going to turn back to Dr. Blunt, who will give us our closing word and benediction. Good night, all.
Again, thank you, Ted. I'm sorry that I don't have the opportunity to do what we do, Sharon and I do, when we have our lecturers here in person. That is to take you out for a meal after this first wonderful lecture. But know that you're in our hearts and our minds, and with great gratitude for your word for us this evening. And now, in the name of the one who makes all things new, let us go forth in hope, in trust, and in faithful anticipation. Go in peace, everyone. God bless.
Thank you, Dr. Blunt, and thank you for watching. We hope you'll join us again for tomorrow's events, which begin at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.